White wines will gain color as they age. They will
Oh,
also become a little bit duller in color as they age. It's literally the juice oxidizing. One of the things I find really overrated about wine is the prominence of brands. Once something has achieved sort of mass market status
hmm
and become this like sort of sensation, then to me it's jump the shark, as they say in television. Again, you can't go wrong with a California Sauvignon Blanc, which tends to be cheaper than Chardonnay, but still people love Sauvignon Blanc.
well, sommelier sound like, from what I know,
Mm-hmm.
a person who goes around restaurants
Mm-hmm.
and sips wine and
Yes,
enjoys lives.
there are a lot of people who claim to be sommeliers who have worked in a restaurant. There's you can study to become a sommelier, but ultimately, what a sommelier is someone who manages the wine program of a restaurant, who selects and serves wine in a restaurant. That is the fundamental job of a sommelier. I'm at this point, I'm kind of a sommelier emeritus. I haven't been in restaurants for some time now, but um, I was, and for quite a long time, both in New York and San Francisco. I feel like someone can only really call themselves a sommelier if they've actually spent time uncorking bottles, pouring taste for people, and serving, managing the wine service of a restaurant.
By managing the wine service of a restaurant, you mean selecting the right wines and pairing them? Like, what does it even mean?
Well, for one thing, most of the time, the sommelier in a restaurant, when a restaurant can afford to have one,
hmm
is the person who is the wine buyer. So they're the one who is getting there in the afternoon and meeting up with different representatives from different importing companies or distributors and deciding, okay, I want to, they write the wine list.
hmm
And from there at night, when you're serving dinner or lunch for that matter, um, advising customers who have questions. It's one of two things. You're either taking an order and going and getting it and serving it to someone, or someone might say, hey, tell me a little bit about this wine and what, where I'm having this, what should I have with it? And so you're making suggestions, you're giving information about the wines that are on your list. So in much the same way that a waiter is expected to have expertise about the food menu, the sommelier is meant to be that person who has expertise about the wine and talking about it in a way that is hopefully not pretentious and off-putting, um, and not simply taking someone to the most expensive bottle and saying, hey, you should have that one.
Yeah, I
uh,
feel like everyone does.
there are a lot of stereotypes, and some people in the profession definitely live up to those, still today.
I've read that the exam that you have to take to become a sommelier is pretty difficult.
There are several different exams that and when I first started out in restaurants, which was a good 20 years ago, there wasn't as much of that accreditation going
Mhm.
on as there is today. In Europe, there is definitely a process. You go to kind of sommelier school, and there are two or three sets of disciplines that you develop. In my case, it was all kind of self-taught as opposed to go and take getting certification. I'm not a master sommelier,
hmm
but a master sommelier is someone who has gone through a series of different certifications before that. There's an advanced sommelier before you're a master sommelier, but the initial examinations are typically factual. So, learning about the wines of the world, knowing that Bordeaux is in France and that it's made from a certain number of grape varieties and what those grape varieties are, and just understanding the basics about how wine is made, how it's produced.
hmm
Um, and then there's typically also a service component to it. So, how do you open a bottle correctly? How do you pour it correctly? How can you tell if the wine is flawed or not? If it's corked or if it's otherwise damaged in some way that you wouldn't find it serviceable to the customer. And then there's typically a tasting component to these exams as well, where you're asked to identify certain styles of wine blind, meaning you don't have any information about it. It's just a liquid in a glass, and you're trying to identify, okay, it's this grape. and it's from roughly this vintage, or it's about this old. And that's really the final frontier when you're able to um, master blind tasting. That's really the assumption then, is that someone who's able to really identify certain styles of wine from around the world, then there's someone that I think you can really trust to sort of say, well, I've tasted a lot of these kinds of wines, and the ones that we selected for the list I felt were best representatives of that category, whatever it might be. And so there's a certain sort of trust factor that you earn by uh, through all of this sort of repetitive and comparative tasting.
That thing with vintage
Yeah.
of wine, that makes no sense to me.
There are a few things, and again, this is a lot. There's a lot of deductive reasoning that goes on.
Hmm.
You get presented a glass of wine. Let's say it's a glass of white wine.
Hmm.
White wines will gain color as they age. They will
Oh,
also become a little bit duller in color as they age. It's literally the juice oxidizing. If you think about a apple that you've cut open and you leave the apple on the counter for a while, eventually it's going to turn brown, right?
yep.
So similarly, as a white wine gets older, if it's stored well and the cork doesn't disintegrate and all of that, the wine will have this like very, very limited creep of oxygen over time. There are chemical compounds that are reacting with each other during this time as well. But really, ultimately, what's happening is that the wine is oxidizing. And so, if I looked at a white wine and it was really brilliant in color and it had almost like a little greenish tint to it sometimes in white wines, then I would assume it's a younger wine. Whereas if the wine had this very deep golden color, leaning towards amber, leaning towards brown, I'm gonna I'm gonna date it accordingly. It's like cutting a tree open and counting the rings. And so you're making assumptions based on your experience that tell you, oh, I think this wine is about X number of years old. I've seen guys and ladies nail vintage. They say it's from 1997, and it's even producer in some cases, which is pretty incredible. Um, but it's practice. It's like the 10,000 hour idea. If you
Yeah. Wow.
spend enough time, so people who are training for the master sommelier exam spend a lot of time in groups, tasting blind, discussing back and forth, picking up the markers that are very typical of certain wines from certain areas of the world. Certain grape varieties have certain markers as well. And over time, you start to develop this kind of just sort of intuitive sense about it because you just practiced it so much and you've tasted a lot of wines. I mean, where I work now, we are a website, we're an e-commerce retailer, and so we sell wine in a variety of different channels. We have daily offers that we send out that we write about. We have monthly club subscriptions of a variety of types. We have an online shop, but in any case, we're tasting constantly to select wines for our offers, for our clubs, whatever it might be. And so, for example, if someone pours me a wine blind, there's a lot I can just tell by the color.
Hmm.
It's white or red, what category I can maybe rule out. That's what a lot of it is ruling out what it isn't and trying to hone in on what it is. And really, ultimately, the value of that, beyond being a fun parlor game to play, is you develop a kind of an idea of like, especially when you get to taste the really great stuff, right? The stuff that is universally acclaimed and thought to be the best example of a type. Then you have this idea in your mind every time you encounter another wine from that place or from that grape. You have a certain sort of measuring stick to work with that is based in a lot of comparison. So I don't know. I always think of it like, I mean, wine criticism compared to, like, let's say, I don't know, literary criticism or music criticism. There's a lot of contemporaries of an author or a musician to whom you might compare that person and sort of make a judgment about where they rank. I think wine is very similar in that regard.
Is wine your drink of choice when you have a choice? Or you
Yes,
got so much tired of it and you're like, oh, anything
it
but wine.
is. And it's funny because, I came to wine certainly not in college. like a lot of people talk about their wine epiphany happening in college. Mine did not happen in college, but it was fairly soon thereafter. There are a lot of folks that talk about, oh, I had a sip of X at a dinner party and I changed my life. I can't point to one bottle and one vintage and so forth that was my epiphany wine, but it is my choice. And I would say I came to it last. It was beer, and then it was spirits, things like bourbon and stuff like that. Because actually, I was some of my earliest jobs out of college as a writer were I was interested in the wine world and the food world, but my beat, so to speak, was spirits. So I was writing about Scotch whiskey and tequila and things like that. And then finally kind of graduated to wine after that.
You basically saying you're a normal kid who actually start drinking real stuff before becoming classy.
Basically, yeah. Yeah.
I know nothing about wine, by the way, nothing. I actually teetotaler, but I'm just fascinated with the way it's the bottles and all this stuff. But when people say I tried one, it blew my mind, it changed my life, it kind of almost like sounds like BS a little bit, is it? Isn't it?
No, it's not BS. And here's why. Because everyone's got their enthusiasms, right?
Hmm.
There might be, in your case, I don't know what you're into. Maybe you're like you love music, and because I know there are certainly albums in
Hmm.
my life, because I'm a big music guy. I'm thrilled that my son's a musician, and I can tell you there are albums in my life that not only changed my life, but also make me remember certain periods in my life really vividly. And so I think it's very much the same for wine. I think there's a lot of people who want it to be bullshit. For example, here's another great one: audiophiles.
Hmm.
Okay, so it's similar to music, but like, can you really tell the difference between this amp and that amp? I'm fascinated by it. I don't know anything about it, but I respect it because I know that there are people that can tell the difference between not only like vinyl versus digital, but this type of power amp versus the other kind of power amp. So it's all kind of what turns you on. And I love to cook too. And when you really nail a dish, that level of satisfaction is really high. And I don't know if you like to eat, but to me, it can't be bullshit because look at how many people just go nuts over food. Wine is food. So it really kind of stands to reason that it's not bullshit.
I feel like I really rubbed you the wrong way when I said it's a
No,
BS.
no, not at
Yeah, I
all.
did.
The thing is though, I was just on a ski trip with all my friends, right? All my college buddies. So we go back. This is a ski trip that's been going on annually for 30 some odd years, right? And they have me ship wine out. None of them are really into wine in like on my level. And I always get kind of super self-conscious about talking about because they're asking me all these questions, and I'm just kind of like, it's it. But I kind of short shrift it because I spend all my time every day talking about wine. So I'm kind of like, I don't really want to do. It's kind of like asking a guy who's a lawyer for legal advice while you're on the chairlift. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But they're really curious about it, and it's fun to share. But I'm also really self conscious about it because of there's still that image of a sommelier or someone who's into wine being pretentious and being very full of themselves and lording their knowledge over other people. And what I would say is the thing I say this a lot actually, because I do a fair amount of speaking about wine. Connoisseur, if you define that word, if you break it down to its roots, a connoisseur is not a snob. It's not a actually I co-wrote a book called The Wine Snob's Dictionary, by the way. It's out of print, but it's a funny book. I'm going to send you one. I still have a couple
Oh,
copies.
thanks. I saw it on Amazon. Yeah,
Yeah,
I read that and another book as well.
I'm going to send you one. But connoisseur is someone who is so interested in something that they just want to know everything about it. It's really rooted in this like sort of passion thing as opposed to pretension.
Hmm.
Um, but it's so hard not to come off pretentious. And that's what the Wine Snobs Dictionary was about this insider language that you develop. So you don't just say, oh, that smells good. You say it has a nice nose, right? Oh, it has a wonderful nose. there's all this lingo that wine people use that other people don't use, but it's also kind of like how we talk. It's just it's an unfortunate result in the same way that, like I say, an
Uh,
audiophile might have some technical terms that you have no idea what he's talking about.
yeah, have you seen this movie, The Menu?
I haven't seen it yet. I'm curious to see it. I know that there's some like heavy product placement in there, and there's some like wine geeks are into it because there's some specific wines that have some reputation, and they did a good job with the details, I'm told.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I don't want to spoil it for you, but there is Sommelier there as well. So you're gonna enjoy it. You enjoy it. I'm curious actually to hear your opinion after the movie. Because there is like a message, and I'm curious if what do you think about the message.
And I haven't watched The Bear either. I was in the restaurant business for 15 some odd years. I originally started out as a writer for magazines, and I gravitated towards this food and wine world, and then eventually was in it in a very real way, both in New York and San Francisco. Pretty much every depiction of restaurants that
Mhm.
I've seen in film or television is way off.
Yeah,
I'm I'm told that The Bear is actually really good, and really nails all the details. I've had my fill of chefs who yell and scream, and like it's like, all right, I get it. I've sort of been there, done that.
is it real? I know that you work with Mario Batali.
Worked with Batali. I worked with a great chef in San Francisco, Michael Tusk. Batali wasn't so much of a yeller. I mean, he some of his lieutenants were some major yellers. And it was there's my one of I was the GM of the restaurant for a while, and that was one of my main preoccupations, unfortunately, was managing relations between the so-called back of the house and the front of the house.
Uh-huh.
Because the kitchen people kind of resent the waiters because they make all the money, and
Yes.
so whenever they get a chance, they yell at them. They relish when a waiter screws up, or so that they have the opportunity to yell at them. And it's part of me is like, yeah, the waiter kind of deserves it, and part of me is like, and that's all changing now. There's like a huge cultural shift in restaurants right now where it's a reckoning, because the model, especially in the United States, is completely whacked financially. I mean, the people who are making the food make terrible money. We've seen a lot of stuff in the news about some of the real high profile chefs using a lot of unpaid apprentices to get a lot of this work done. And so compensating the kitchen has been a great upshot, not only of COVID, but of just in recent times. Don't get me started. I'm a little bit of a what they call a libtard. I'm a little bit of a left winger.
That's okay. Come
We've
bring it on.
our economy's been built on the exploitation of labor for a long time. So the fact that restaurants are having this reckoning is is a microcosm of, I think, the world at large. The world as a whole. That the people that produce stuff should be paid accordingly, as opposed to just the people that sell stuff. But anyway, I digress. We're not talking about wine anymore. Now I'm starting to get.
That's fine. I used to work at a diner, and even at that lower level, it's the same situation. Cooks make minimum, and we as the servers make most of the money. It wasn't
Yeah,
fair. Yeah.
I think everyone should work in hospitality at some point in their life. It's incredibly humbling. One of the things about where I worked in New York when I was working for Mario Vitali at Babbo was I wasn't just a wine guy. Like, I was involved in kind of everything. Like the wine guys were part of the service in every way. So it wasn't just like we were just strictly dealing with wine. We were running food from the kitchen. We were helping carve steaks or chickens or whatever, and so participating in this whole thing, it makes you feel like a host at a
Hmm.
really good dinner party, and it makes you feel like a very competent. Look at this guy. He's cutting a steak and he's pouring the wine and he's running things, you know what I mean? And you're running the service. And it is quite satisfying. It's obviously really stressful,
Yeah.
and people are really weird. It was like I was performing for people as opposed to trying to commune with them or become their friend. So that's very important. You can't like take it personally, otherwise you're screwed. You're going to just be so angry and not happy, and it's just not going to be the right fit.
Yeah, you definitely have to watch the menu then. Hey, so James Beard Award. Is it? Didn't you get for that?
Yeah, James Beard was. So you know who James Beard was, I assume, or maybe
Yeah.
he's a very prominent cookbook author and sort of like the first. He kind of predates Julia Child. An American food personality, lived in the West Village in New York City, and was a pretty well regarded cookbook author. And he's the namesake of a foundation in New York that uh, is devoted to culinary education and food in the food and wine business. And so the foundation, as a way of really, raising its profile as well as its funds, created the awards years ago. And it's sort of the short kind of thumbnail on it is that it's the so-called Oscars of the food industry. So there's a whole journalism side to it,
Hmm.
which is the kind of like how they give out the technical Oscars at some other like Holiday Inn the weekend before. Yeah,
No.
the sound the sound engineering Oscar, you get at a different ceremony that's not televised.
Oh, you mean the real? Okay, I thought it's just
No, no,
mocking them.
journalism
Okay.
awards are part of it, and they're important. And people submit their work from different publications, and there's a committee that looks at it, and there's a bunch of different categories.
Hmm.
And previous to getting into restaurants, I won one for an article I wrote about tequila,
Oh,
um,
nice.
a James Beard Journalism Award, and then several years later, Bobo won the James Beard Award for Outstanding Wine Service. So there are restaurant awards, best new restaurant, best chef. They're regionalized. There's a lot of different categories. We won for best wine service. That was super cool and really like everyone's in tuxedos and to go up on stage and accept it. Daniel Boulou, the famous chef, was the one who was the presenter of my category, so I got to accept my award from Daniel Boulou. And it was very exciting and give a speech and everything. So,
Oh, you gave a speech too. That's pretty awesome.
oh yeah, acceptance speech is pretty sweet.
Wow, nice.
Yeah, it's been
Yeah.
all downhill from there. That was 2004. I just,
Ah, come on. Don't be humble.
career's been spiraling down the drain ever since.
No. Let's talk wine a little bit.
Yeah, let's.
And what I want to talk about is there are like millions of brands of wine,
Yes.
millions of types of wine. And I want to ask you to call out some of them that maybe even by name. Okay, so here's what I'll give you the parallel. So let's talk about watch Rolex, right? In my view, Rolex is expensive, overrated, mediocre looking watch that
Mhm.
people buy for status,
Mhm.
not because it's really beautiful or something. What types of wine, what brand of wine is the same?
There are a lot of them. The overrated question was, I think, the first one on your list. I always considered Rolex to be kind of like a quality leader, but perhaps that's not the case. I don't really know because I don't know anything about watches. There's guys that collect watches, right? That know all about this stuff.
Yep.
But there are a lot of wines. I mean, in my view, the idea that certain wines cost $1,000 a bottle, it's one thing if it's a really fine and rare older vintage something, okay, but there are a lot of things coming out now in California, for example, that are what are called cult wines. They're made in very, very small quantities. They are made by very high priced and very kind of celebrity level winemaker consultant type folks. It's a kind of a formula, and the wines come out and they're five, six, $1,000 on release, and they're definitely overrated. And I don't like naming names because I'm still gotta be careful because who knows if maybe one day we get an allocation of one of these overrated wines and we want to try to sell it on our site. But the overrated thing for me in wine is brands. So like the idea of branding in wine to me is typically works out bad for the consumer, in my opinion. If you think about some of the most popular wine brands, there are things like Rombauer Chardonnay, which has become this like sensation, right? Or The Prisoner, or for that matter, Yellowtail from Australia,
Yep.
or wines that are like really essentially take a spirits approach to wine. as opposed to a traditional place first approach to wine. For example, the appellation systems for wine that were created, the first to really codify them were the French with appellation contrôlée. So that means it's the same for food too. There's protected designations of origin.
Mhm.
So such and such a cheese, such and such a wine must come from this particular place, and it must be made in this particular way in order to carry that name. Those were the first brands in wine. It wasn't some cute like creature or it wasn't an invention of a marketing department. It was a place name, and the place name still to this day on a lot of French wines in particular is the largest type on the label. The producers is often really, really small.
Hmm.
You know, you see Burgundy, for example, in France, Bourgogne. Oftentimes in Burgundy, especially on the more traditional bottles, Bourgogne is the brand, not domain such and such. Okay. And one of the things I find really overrated about wine is the prominence of brands, these sort of mass. Once something has achieved sort of mass market status
Mhm.
and become this like sort of sensation, then to me it's jumped the shark, as they say in television. It has overstayed its welcome, and it doesn't matter the price point you're at. Even at the lower price point where some of these wines they're well done, they're perfectly good drinkable wines, there's nothing wrong with them, but if you can drink something authentic for the same price, which you can if there's someone out there looking for it, it doesn't matter if it's 10, 15, 20, you can still find authentic wines from what I would call more artisanal producers than the brand. Like with a spirits product, yes, the branding methodology, it's effectively the same all the time, right? It's a product that's made to a certain specification, but there's so much more variability in wine, mainly vintage variability, but it's a more agricultural product than spirits. I mean, spirits does have an agricultural connection, so does beer. I mean, they're both
Mhm.
made from grains that ideally you're not using grains that have been farmed with a bunch of chemicals, and hopefully not. So there's a similar thing, but it is a more sort of direct translation of an agricultural product than either of the others. Beer's pretty close. I mean, beer's quite similar in that regard. And but I feel like the if something is a brand, it's almost kind of by nature overrated, in my opinion. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
It's
it
a
makes sense.
little bit of a hedge against naming, wines that I think are overrated. I mean, there's tons of, well, basically any wine over $200 a bottle, in my opinion, is overrated.
Oh,
Just
thanks. Here
I
you go.
can't afford them. Part of my job is to find the ones that cost 50 or 30 that perform like the 200s.
Mhm.
That's where you're really hitting it is. And I've seen this in my life many times. Many years ago, I did a story about wine auctions for Wine and Spirits magazine. And so wine auctions are a very good example of people paying a lot of money for wines that are probably overrated. Some of them are magical and delicious and incredible, but ultimately, most of the people that are buying those wines aren't necessarily able to discern just how magical those are, right? But
Mhm.
more importantly, it's a very narrow universe of what people consider a collectible wine. It's a few regions. It's very Franco-centric. And it is, I remember going to this guy's house on Fifth Avenue in New York City. Like he converted one of the rooms in his beautiful apartment on Central Park into a wine room. But in that wine room were not that many different kinds of wine. It was a very narrow focus on a handful of producers, mostly Bordeaux producers, and then just multiple vintages of that Bordeaux producer. And to me, if I had the disposable income, it'd be wines from all over the place. Like it would be like all over the place. I mean, yeah, I'd sure go for those, but I'm just going to keep drinking 2000 Chateau Margaux for the rest of my life. Just keep drinking that and have like tons of cases of it, and just that's all I want. It was a very narrow list of producers, and that to me isn't buying wine. That's buying labels.
Seems like we're not gonna be criticizing particular brands, which is a shame. But I wanted to have some
I mean, yeah, no,
to kill somebody. That's fun.
mean, Prisoner. I'll call them out. That those wines are terrible, and people like go crazy for them. You know,
Really? Oh yeah, actually saw it. Even I saw it. It's like it's catchy, pretty
it's
catchy, frankly.
it's all about the bottle and not what's inside.
Yeah, but it's for people who don't have as much experience as you do, right? They don't know how to distinguish between good and bad wine.
But it's also like an engineer. Like there's one of the things that sommeliers get agitated about is that there's like when you scale wine, there are certain things you have to do. You have to like kind of engineer it. You know what I mean? And so
Yeah.
it's not as pure a kind of an expression of wine anymore. It starts to feel like this beverage. It feels like something that it's sort of predictable. There's not a lot of nuance there. There's typically very little to no earthiness, which is something that wine geeks are really turned on by, is this idea that, oh, I can taste like that this came from limestone soil, or that this came from, where you feel like this deeper connection to where it came from. And those types of wines that are engineered to be brands completely lose any kind of like sort of connection to where they're from. And so for a dork like me, it's sort of like I just I don't want to put that in my mouth.
It's almost like a clash between art and business, right?
Oh yeah.
That's how I see it.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that like we have traditionally in America, most wine marketing, such as it is still really born out of a spirits model.
Hmm.
One of my first jobs out of college was for a publication. It was a trade publication covering the beverage industry. I worked for some people that were heavy spirits people, and the whole idea was to like make someone a Chivas drinker for life, like to identify with that brand. That was the ultimate goal, right? I'm a Chivas guy. Guys of like my dad's generation had their right. You had your drink, like you probably have one. I don't know. Well, you said you're a teetotaler, but like I remember thinking like, all right, I'm in my 20s. I'm a man now. I've got to have like my drink. That's my drink.
Yeah.
I'd like a bourbon Manhattan with Maker's Mark, please. Because you want to sound like you know what you're talking about, and you want to be associated with that brand and that drink. And that's, to me, I don't know. I'm very susceptible to it, but I find it's so insidious, and I'm just like, kind of like, I can't believe I'm falling for this.
What's the
The
do you think
Rolex thing. It's the Rolex thing.
yeah. Rolex, here we go.
Like
We went
I
back
gotta
to
have a
where I
Rolex.
started.
If I have a Rolex, it makes me feel better about myself, and so having this association with these brands is very similar. And so like this gets back to this collector thing. If you just love wine and you want to drink great older wines that are super representative of their places and are capable of aging for a long time and are going to give you these magical wine experiences as someone who like truly loves wine, I could put a whole cellar together for you, and you never have to spend more than $100 a bottle. And I found this in the restaurant too. Sometimes if a wine doesn't move, charge more for it. It's like there's just a certain belief system that people have. Like it can't be collectible if it's less than $100 a bottle. You know what I mean? I paid $250 for this bottle, therefore it's got to be good. That's a function of branding too.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean that's exactly how people think of stuff. What about wine that is underrated? Now we actually can talk about particular brand because
I would say rather than underrated, I would say undervalued. And the reason
okay.
I say that is because really, like the moment we're living in right now in terms of wine, like even in some of the sort of most remote corners of the world, there's quality wine being made. I mean, the sort of technology, the equipment, the expertise um, has spread to a lot of places that maybe it didn't exist 30 or 50 years ago, where even in places like the south of Italy, for example, that were poorer regions like Calabria and Puglia, like they only had their coming out party, 20 years ago, as opposed to 50, because a lot of wineries down there were operating in a very sort of not so clean, not so technologically advanced environment. It was just kind of like throw it in there and see what happens kind of thing. But now I feel like there's lots of good, like the baseline of quality is at a very high level right now. So it's really more about what's undervalued.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a huge part of my life is seeking out those places in the world which for whatever reasons are really undervalued. One that comes immediately to mind is Portugal, which might sound crazy because you're like, well, wait a minute. Portugal is like one of the most ancient wine cultures ever. You know, port wine, the fortified wine, is like one of the best known wines. You know, Madeira wine was one of, like, Thomas Jefferson used to drink that stuff, right? So, like, how is Portugal undiscovered or an emerging market? Well, Portugal didn't enter the European Union until 1986. It had a dictatorship for a long period of time. There was no real focus on developing quality wine brands that were anything more than just for the for the table. You can find all sorts of stuff from Portugal under $20 a bottle that's spectacular because the natural gifts are all there. Now the investment is coming up, but they're not able to fetch the prices that Napa Valley or Bordeaux or Burgundy can fetch because it's still an sort of untested product out there in the world. But also, these are a lot of like long established family estates that have owned the real estate forever, and their input costs are a lot lower than they are in Northern California.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a lot of other things, a lot of other factors that go into play because there are lots of upstarts in California that you're like, well, this is an untested product, never heard of this guy. But by virtue of the cost of their inputs, how much the real estate is, how much they're paying for grapes, how much they're paying for their facilities, how much they're paying their people. I mean, in like rural Portugal, they're not making $15 an hour, you know? So there's a lot of other factors. Unfortunately, I'm in California. I can get a Portuguese wine. I had to come all the way across the ocean through the Panama Canal and then up the, and then be distributed to the store here in California. I can still buy it for less than most California wine that's being made a half an hour away in the Napa Valley. You know what I mean? So it's crazy, but it's the relative economics of these different places in the world are such that right now, Portugal is probably the most exciting emerging market for me in terms of both red and white wines. There's been a huge shift away from the sweet fortified wines of port towards just dry table wines from white and red grapes, and they have the what we say the terroir for it. They have the land, they have the climate, they have the soil, they have the know-how, and the wines are delicious, and you can buy all sorts of incredible stuff for 15-20 bucks a bottle. The other place that's like, wait a minute, that's a super traditional wine nation, but it is really only like having its moment like kind of right now is Spain. Galicia in Spain is like the talk of the town. And when I first was getting into wine, I hadn't even considered it. It never even crossed my mind to look for wine from Galicia. So you're talking about the northwestern corner of Spain, a very unique climate and conditions for making wine compared to the rest of Spain, which is almost in many cases high desert in a lot of these places. But in the case of Galicia, is very
Moist here, right? It's like Santa Cruz here.
it's colder, it's wetter. It's this tangle of incredible river valleys. The soils are very, very poor. It's a lot of decomposed granite soil. And both the reds and whites from there, from places like Ribera Sacra, Rias Baixas, Ribeiro, there's all these appellations up there that are wines with a lot of character, um, wines with a lot of story behind them, which I think is always fascinating, but also just like they're not engineered flavors. They feel, that's another thing I think when people travel, right? Sorry, I go off on a lot of tangents. I hope this
No, no,
doesn't.
no. It's all makes sense.
When people travel, they drink a glass of wine. They're like, this is the best wine I ever had in my life. I got to send home a case of that to my house. And you can totally find it probably in the US, but you do it anyway. You ship it to your house. And it probably doesn't necessarily match up with the experience that you had there
Mm-hmm.
because there the wine was probably transported like down the street from a local winery as opposed to shipped across the ocean. So a lot can happen to it. Heat, light, all sorts of things can mess with it. But ultimately, what it comes down to is like it's not a formula. It's like they become the way they are due to a variety of factors. The best wines to me are wines that ended up that way because of where they come from, as opposed to wines that were engineered to taste a certain way. There's all sorts of additives winemakers can put in wine to create a certain effect. All sorts of stuff, color, texture, different yeasts you can use to produce different reactions that will produce different aromas. All sorts of ways to engineer the flavor of a wine. And I don't think you need to be an expert to tell when that's happening or when it's not. Getting into wine is more about kind of finding what you like. It's not like trying to decide if this is good or bad. It's trying to find what you like. Because really, frankly, we're starting, as I said, at a very high bar in terms of basic quality. Then it's a question of, do you like more acidity in your wine? Or do you like it to be softer and kind of more viscous and a little sweet? We have a very sweet palate in America. We like Coca-Cola and all that, right? And so we don't tend to like really bone dry white wines. We want our white wines to be, let's say it's the Chardonnay grape. Traditional white wines from Burgundy in France, which is kind of a cool climate, and the soil has a lot of limestone in it, which has an effect of preserving acidity in grapes. But it's also a cooler climate, so they're not going to get so super ripe where you have this inverse relationship of sugar and acid going on. As the grape gets more mature, it develops more fermentable sugars, which means it has more potential alcohol and it has more potential for maybe having some still unfermented sugar left over. Also, when you have more alcohol, glycerol is created along with alcohol. Glycerol is an alcohol sugar. It's typically the feeling of viscosity on the palate. So like oftentimes higher alcohol wines will also give this impression of being more almost syrupy, and when you swirl them in the glass, the tears that roll down are a little slower moving.
Yep, I saw that.
Kind of grab the side of the glass a little bit more. That's typically a telltale sign of a higher alcohol wine. So when you're blind tasting, you're looking at that and saying it's a higher alcohol wine, so I can rule out this, and this place because they're not known for that. That's a crazy number of tangents I just went on right there. That was like exit 26B/9/
yeah.
Hector. I don't know what the hell I'm doing.
So wait, so Spanish wine versus Portuguese wine, is it the pricing is also a little
Spanish
different?
right now, there's certain regions that are better established that, but still like one of the most underrated fine red wines in the world is Spanish Rioja. You can buy Spanish Rioja red wines. There are very historic, what they call bodegas, wineries in Rioja.
Yep.
Rioja has a very sort of well-structured system for their red wines in particular. There's different categories. There's crianza, which is a fresher wine released very close to when the vintage was. And then you kind of climb the ladder of different reserva levels where they're holding onto the wine in the barrel and then in the bottle before the wine is released. This happens in Italy in places like Barolo and Piedmont, for example, too. They have a minimum aging requirement before they release the wine into the marketplace. So these wines are built in such a way that they don't want to just send them out the spring following the vintage. They don't feel they're ready to be consumed until much later than that. So they've had some time for their flavors to integrate inside of a barrel and then eventually inside of a bottle as well, for that time for the wine to settle down, to come together, for its sort of stability, if you will. So for example, a Barolo wine, if you made it in 2020, you won't see that wine in the marketplace until 2024. It won't be released for sale. They're holding on to that inventory. It's like I grow a tomato, I harvest a tomato, I sell the tomato the minute it's ripe. That's not how a lot of these wines work. I grow the wine, I make the wine, and then I leave the wine in my cellar for 4 years before I sell it. There are some marvelous older Rioja wines that are essentially pre-aged for you. You know, you don't have to buy them and then wait to drink them. You always see that when you read critics, right? They say drink or hold. Nobody wants to hold. I
Yeah.
mean, people want to hold because they want to tour their friends down in their wine cellar and show them, oh, look what I got. In terms of like drinking wine, 99% of all wine in the world is consumed within 1 year of its release. So there's a very small like category of wines that are held onto for any length of time in somebody's cellar, and a very small percentage of people who do that.
Let's talk about the pairing wine, right? There
Yeah.
are always there's some rule of thumb, right? Can we go through them?
Yes. You know, a lot of people talk about pairing wine in terms of complementary pairings versus contrasting pairings. And so complementary pairings would be instances where there might be a particular sort of chord of flavor in a dish that you can mimic with the wine in some way. Contrasting pairings tend to be a little bit more textural. I'm all about contrasting pairings and using the wine as a reagent, if you will, like sort of acid, for example, cuts fat. Okay.
Uh-huh.
So there was a dishwashing liquid called Palmolive. Palmolive created a diner waitress named Madge who oversaw the dishwashing, I guess, in the diner. And so she swore by Palmolive because it had the best grease cutting capabilities, right? So one of the times they added lemon to Palmolive because lemon juice cuts fat, right? And when they
Mhm.
put the Palmolive in the greasy thing with all the plates in it, all the grease went like that, like sort of went away.
I
And
saw it. Yep.
so you use the wine, to me, using the acidity in wine to kind of cleanse your palate and be a foil for fatty food is number one. That's kind of the most basic, and it's oftentimes overlooked. A lot of people say with wine pairing, you should match the scale of the dish with the scale of the wine. So you get this big ribeye steak, and I don't know, maybe it's covered in like mushrooms, or it's like it's got a over polenta with all the sauce on top, or something kind of. So I want to serve this huge wine with it, and a lot of times
What do you mean huge wine? Can you
like
elaborate?
really full bodied, really like sort of heavy, maybe high alcohol, with a
Like
lot of
Cabernet or what was it? Syrah? What is it?
Cabernet Sauvignon. Yeah, sure. Usually it's like Cabernet and steak, right? But a
Hmm.
lot of times with a lot of these Cabernets, they're so ripe tasting, they're so fruity. They're so constant, they have so much fruit concentration that to me it's like spreading jelly on your steak. I don't want I'd rather have something that was more earthy and savory and picks up on the bloodiness of the steak and has some acidity that kind of cuts into it, like a Chianti from Tuscany, or a Barbera from Piedmont, or any wine with a little more acidity, a little less of that heavy duty fruit. There's wines to be tasted in a panel and decide which one's the best, and there's wines to eat with food, or drink with food, and they are two totally different wines. And when you're dealing with wines that have this big scores and everything like that, those are like show wines. They're like wines that are being assessed in a vacuum. They're humongous, and most of them, when you think about it, and I used to do this when I was with the Wine and Spirits magazine, we had panel tastings. You're talking 40 Cabernets from Napa Valley in one shot. They come out in waves, but you're sitting there with a bunch of other people and you're going to taste through 40, 15% alcohol Cabernet Sauvignons. Which one's going to stand out in a blind tasting? It's going to be the biggest one, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Sweetest one, the most satisfying, right? The ones that are kind of tart and they're not really like giving you much love. You don't have any contact. It's side by side, so you have that context, but you're not using it in the way that you're supposed to use wine, which is as a beverage to have with your meal, right? So you're drinking these wines in this like very sterile vacuum, and you're making these decisions, and ultimately the biggest wine is going to win, and ultimately the biggest wine is also going to overpower, not to mention kind of weigh you down. So like you're halfway through your steak and you're hammered, um, kind of just feeling like it's like lots of alcohol. You're like flush. You have like a heart attack. You're like Diamond Jim Brady. You kind of fall over at the table into your soup. It's just like it's too much. So I know that's been big with me as I've gotten older. It's like my palate has gotten a lot lighter. Like I was way more attracted to the big blockbuster, heavy duty, full bodied reds when I was younger, and now I like them a lot lighter.
We spoke a little bit about steaks and what goes with steaks. But what about
Well,
some
I
other
mean,
food?
there's some classic things that may sound cliche, but it's true. I mean, generally speaking, white wines tend to work better with fish, for a variety of reasons. I mean, one of the things that white wine does not have that red wine does is tannin. So tannins in red wine tend to create that drying effect. I typically find that in addition to the flavors not being complementary, the texture is often not complementary either. It often makes, to me, red wines often make a lot of fish taste kind of metallic because of the presence of tannins. Tannins are more perceived on like kind of your tongue, like almost like the drying of your tongue and the drying of your palate in general, kind of like oversteeped tea gives you that bitter drying effect. Whereas acidity ignites the salivary response. It causes you to salivate a little bit. So when a wine is high in acidity, it's causing you to salivate. When a wine is high in tannin, it tends to dry your mouth out a little bit. Set aside the fact that like the flavors in red wine, the notable exception would be salmon, for example, which is a little richer fish, a little deeper, like some flavors, and it's often cooked either over like sort of like wood
Mhm.
fired is
Yep.
very popular, and so some of the smokiness that you get in salmon and some of those deeper flavors can be really great with Pinot Noir, for example, which is but that's a much lighter red with a lot less tannin than say Cabernet Sauvignon, for example, and so it's a little more delicate. There's lots of great red wine and fish pairings out there, but generally speaking, I tend to prefer white. I tend to prefer, generally speaking, with pairing with food, wines that aren't that aggressive in terms of their aromatics and like certain well, I shouldn't say that because like Riesling, for example, from Germany, especially some Rieslings where there's a little bit of residual sweetness in the wine are magical with spicy Asian cuisines, Thai, Chinese, whatever subset of Chinese you're in, where you have a wine that is. Here's another little technical detail. A lot of those German Rieslings, for example, are very low in alcohol. Alcohol and tannin are going to exaggerate spice in food. They make it hotter.
Mm.
And so you really want to kind of avoid those things. So like that's why I wouldn't pair a really big, powerful Cabernet Sauvignon
With
with
Thai food, yeah,
Thai
makes
food
sense.
because it's just going to make my mouth like on fire, right?
Mm.
It's going to exaggerate the spiciness. It's going to exaggerate the heat of the alcohol. Whereas 10% alcohol or less German Riesling with a touch of residual sweetness to boot, it's like a hand in a glove, where the food kind of comes in and then the wine kind of, and there also happen to be in some cases with things like cilantro or scallions or some of the seasonings that there are some kindred qualities in the wine, coriander, things like that you may detect in the aromatics and flavors of the wine sometimes. So there's a little bit of complementary, but mostly it's contrasting. This wine is low alcohol, it has a little touch of sweetness, and then this spice comes in and they meet each other in the middle and they kind of cancel each other out, and it kind of cleans up. And then there are some complementary aromatic components going on. Um, but ultimately, like a lot of times with pairing, it's often what the side dish is that'll drive the pairing more so than what that sort of central protein is on the plate. It's a braised short rib. Okay. Those are easy because it's like, first of all, those are cooked in red wine usually anyway, right? So it's like a braised short rib cooked in red wine, pair it with a big red wine, easy. But what if it comes with like a bunch of horseradish on top? And then there's a side dish of, I don't know, sauteed broccoli rabe or something like that. Like it throws it
David,
all.
just when people thought they start understanding how to pair it, you threw another curveball.
Yeah, you got to throw a curveball. Like here's a classic one. A really classic pairing is Barolo wine, which is a very earthy, spicy. Even when it's young, you get a lot of savor in this red wine. It smells a little bit like leather and antique furniture and mushrooms and all sorts of stuff. And people love to pair it with a very traditional pasta in Piedmont that's just tagliatelle, a fresh, very heavily, like very eggy dough, so it has that really deep color. Fresh, like tagliatelle, which is like a long, thin ribbon with butter and truffles, white truffles shaved on the top. And
Mm.
they're very, very aromatic and they meld really well for each other. But you know what melds even better in my mind is a white wine that's been aged in oak. Like they feel like, because it's like a little bit buttery, it's a little bit creamy, it picks up on the butter, it picks up on the. So there's a lot of different ways to skin the cat. Um, and ultimately, it comes down to, I do think that rule of scale is a good one, except that I generally want the wine to be a little lighter than the food. I don't want to go head, I don't want to meet it head on. And I want to have wines with acidity, not
Mhm.
fat, sweet, high alcohol wines. I want crisp wines that have lift, hopefully not too much tannin, not too much oak. Generally speaking, I want the wine to be the submissive one in the partnership.
Gotcha. Oh, interesting.
People don't like that because it's like, well, I paid a $200 for this bottle of wine. It ain't going to be submissive. You know what I mean? It's like half the time the best wines for pairing with food are simple ones, like muscadet and oysters. The muscadet, I mean, yeah, it's got good flavor, but it's really ultimately it's like a little bit of saltiness, a little bit of creaminess because they age the wine on its yeast, so it takes on a little creamy quality. The fruit is very muted. It's not like a super fruity, pineapple-y ripe kind of wine. It's very dry and crisp. It just cleanses. You have an oyster, maybe a little mignonette, same level of acidity as the oyster and the mignonette, and a little bit of saltiness, and just clean. The wine is like the Zamboni that comes onto the ice after the hockey period and cleans it and makes it smooth again,
Mhm.
and kind of corrects what's going on in your mouth. So like the acidity a lot of times is going to correct a palate that's coated in fat and kind of recalibrate everything that's going on, like all the sort of kind of chemical reactions that are going on in your mouth as you're chewing food and drinking wine. Like the wine is like a corrective for and readying you for another bite of food. Sounds crazy, but it kind of is happening.
This discussion is a perfect case why you need sommeliers, because there is no way people would think about it this way. It's just that's awesome.
I don't want to give sommeliers too much credit, but I do think that, yeah, I mean, the hardest part is getting people to accept the help of the sommelier and being the kind of sommelier that people can read as helpful as opposed to a threat. You know,
Mhm.
most, I think the traditional image of the sommelier is that's like this guy, usually a guy, and he's in a tuxedo and he's got his taste of van around his neck, and he's just an imposing figure who you're supposed to impress. He should be impressing you, the customer, not the other way around. Like you're not taking a test, you're not there for a test. He's not your driving instructor. He's supposed to be serving you. You're supposed to put him to work. That relationship has changed a lot, and most sommeliers these days are not that person. There's nothing that I liked better than someone who said, I'm in your hands, man. What do you think? I want to spend, and here's another big piece of advice from a sommelier. Do not be afraid to talk price. Tell the person, I want to spend $50. I mean, look at the list because there's a lot of lists that jump you past $50 really, really fast.
Mhm.
There might be one wine on the whole wine list that's $50. I don't like places like that. But you're in a restaurant, there's a sommelier in the restaurant. Take advantage of that person. And more importantly, throw the gauntlet down for that person. I want to spend X amount of dollars. I like this, and this. I'm having this. What do you got for me? Make it happen. I would say 8 times out of 10, you're going to be super happy with the result. There'll probably be a few misses in there, you know, but that person then has been empowered to like do something beyond fetch a bottle and open it for you. And if they're worth anything, they're going to try to impress you. They're going to, that's what they're there for. They're supposed to be there to enhance your dining experience, not just extract dollars from you, right? And yes, there's still going to be people upselling you, but that happens at every stage of the dining experience. It happens in fast food. It happens everywhere. So you can see that coming a mile away. That's not, you can still, there's still plenty of people out there that are willing to point you to the cheap one. If that's what you have to be able to read people as a sommelier. But most importantly, like there's some people that were too afraid to talk about price. So we'd have to dance around and point at a bunch of different things until we landed on something, you know? When it would have saved us both a lot of time just tell me. It's not a big deal. It's not awkward.
You're not gonna judge, right?
Yeah, there's no judgments. I mean, most sommeliers don't make a lot of money, so it's not like they're like, oh, you can't afford that. It's I don't know. I hope a lot of that pretension is gone, but I fear that maybe some of it's still there at the very highest levels of dining.
So you talked about the pricing point, and it's actually another subject I want to talk to you about, because it seems like wine is a perfect gift to your friends when you go visit them, or
Mhm.
maybe at work. I've been in the position where I knew that people like the wine, and I wanted to pick something, and I just couldn't, because I'm like, I can't pick this one because it's too cheap, and this is too ridiculous. And how do you even choose the one?
That's a
Like
thorny one. That's really a thorny one. I really think that it's like wine as gifts, you're kind of screwed. I mean, I wish I had a better answer than that. What I would say is, for example, I have a friend who gives wine gifts to his clients every year. The selling point of the gift is that it was selected by me, right? Not so much how expensive the wine is. I mean, yeah, some people will probably look up what the price is, and he's like, I want to spend a good amount. I don't want to be cheap about it, but
yeah,
I don't want to spend a ridiculous amount either.
define both.
Giving wine as a gift is like giving under any other gift. The quality of the gift is reflected in how much thought went into it. Like, how much did you think about what would be a good gift for that person based on what you know about them, right?
Hmm.
Obviously, if it's just someone you don't, it's your future father-in-law, you barely know the guy, you go a little higher, right? You're going to have to spend a few bucks and just sort of say, tell the person, it's my future father-in-law. I just need to get something that's got some reputation. And a lot of times that doesn't need to be the $200 bottle. In fact, if you know the person is really savvy about wine, then they will appreciate the fact that you didn't spend $200 and instead found one that's really has a great quality to price ratio. And they're going to recognize that and be like, oh, that's a smart pick, and it
Well, help me out here. Like, let's talk about a few examples right here, because people are listening. They're like, okay, I wish he told us a little more.
really,
Somebody who is buying wine right now, like maybe it's a brand, maybe it's the region. Let's say under $100.
So, for example, um, let's start. Let's break it down into white, red, and sparkling. Okay.
Okay.
So let's start with sparkling. Okay, sparkling wine is by nature kind of expensive,
Hmm.
but if there is a category where you do not have to spend a giant like it, probably the most branded, the most hyped up category of wine is champagne in France, right? Fancy champagne, wrappers, Cristal, there's certain brands that have a certain cachet. Like it is the most overwrought of the categories in terms of trying to buy a gift for someone. But you can get a magnificent champagne instead of one from one of the big houses like Veuve Clicquot or Moet Chandon or all these some of these fancy brands that make a lot of wine and they charge a lot of money for it because they do a lot of marketing for it and they got to pay for that marketing, so they charge a lot. They also charge a lot because they can, because the brand has been hyped up to the point where people think it's worth $300 or $600 or however much it is. And think about how most people are consuming Cristal champagne. Let's face it, it's in like half the time it's being like poured over a stripper. It's not even like it's not consumed with any kind of thought or consideration. Buying sparkling wine, there's two ways to go. You either do one of countless champagnes you can get for about 50 bucks or under that's going to be magnificent, have a great story, and be delicious. Or you go to the value alternatives. It depends on the occasion, right? But if you're, say, going to a party and you want to bring a sparkling wine to a party, you can either bring a really nice bottle of champagne, which, like, let's say two of the 30 people at the party are going to have any kind of appreciation for whatsoever. Or You can buy a bottle of Aperol and a bottle of Prosecco for the same money and make spritzes for everyone and like blow their minds. Aperol, ice, pour the Prosecco over the top, put a little orange peel in there. It's like the coolest thing. And Prosecco will cost you $15-20 a bottle because it's much less expensive than champagne. It makes a great gift for more of a, depends on the occasion. It depends on the, if it's a engagement party or something, maybe you go with the champagne, but you can find some great value. Then moving into whites, great white wines for gifts. I tend to go classic, right? Rather than go for like the flashy, whatever, the Rombauers, for example, or some of the brands that people associate with fancy white wine. I like to go with like super time honored classics. Go with a Chardonnay from Burgundy. You spend 30-40 bucks. You buy a Bourgogne Chardonnay from a trusted producer. You talk to the store person. You say, listen, I wanted like a classic Burgundy Chardonnay from a good producer. What do you got? Someone who isn't wine educated, it's giving them a grounding in something really meaningful and classic. It's like buying someone Miles Davis kind of blue and giving it to them because they're just getting into jazz. And you want to give them like best demonstrated practices of a great, if someone's not into wine, there's a conversation piece there where it's like, yeah, I just thought this is a super like this is kind of like a building block of wine knowledge that is valuable as opposed to just some fancy wine that was really expensive that they're not going to really understand or appreciate. It depends on the person, right? You have to think about who the recipient is. Another great choice is Sancerre for that reason. Another very classic French white wine from the Loire Valley made from Sauvignon Blanc. Everyone likes Sauvignon Blanc. You can't go wrong with Sancerre. You can't go wrong with an Italian Pinot Grigio. That to me makes people think about travel. It makes people think about the Italian lifestyle and like, sitting on the beach and, there's just a lot of nice imagery around that. I think you can't go wrong with that. Again, you can't go wrong with a California Sauvignon Blanc, which tends to be cheaper than Chardonnay, but still people love Sauvignon Blanc. And I do think the label matters. It's like, I don't want to present someone a bottle of wine with an ugly ass label. And there's a lot of ugly labels out there. And
What
so
define ugly
I'm,
ass
I'm
labels?
all Mr. Oh, it's, wines are like people. It's what's inside the bottle that counts. If the label's ugly, we don't offer it on our website. I can tell you that.
So,
I don't care if
so
it's or not.
Sauvignon Blanc from California. What's like? I thought we just discussed that.
You
Hey,
should be able to pay like 30 bucks and get something really
here you
nice.
go.
I
That's
think for
helpful.
gifts, your sweet spot is 30 to 50.
Perfect.
There's no reason to spend more than that unless the person is someone heavy duty, and in which case you should be looking for, there's a kind of a next tier, right? With white Burgundy, which
Uh
is
huh.
sort of like someone who's a wine collector, that is most likely the wine that they have the most of, the white wine they have the most of in their collection is white Burgundy.
Interesting.
We'll also find some really nice, very distinguished higher end German Rieslings and Austrian white wines that are really wonderful. And, Gruner Veltliner, for example, can be great. On the red side, straight down the middle, Oregon Pinot Noir, Willamette Valley Pinot Noir, 30 to 50 bucks, you're going to find an ocean of awesome stuff. And it's got a story and it's unique and everyone loves it. Good California Pinot Noir is also good. You kind of can't go wrong with Pinot Noir in terms of red because it's the friendliest of the grapes. It's the least, it's very aromatic, it's medium bodied. Everyone loves Pinot Noir. It's just like the thing. Everyone in the wine world loves it. Everyone wants to make it, everyone wants to drink it. So
Mm-hmm.
California, Willamette Valley right now just happens to be from a price quality standpoint, just really in a sweet spot right now. Like you can still find lots of stuff in the 30s that's just off the charts. Whereas in California, maybe you're up, and in Burgundy, you're kind of more up in the 50s, right? It depends, but you're kind of more up in the 50s for the most part, or 40s. Another good down the middle in terms of like a more prestige gift, like a classic Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon from a classic producer like a Chateau Montelena or Mondavi for that matter, or Groth, or Spring Mountain, great wines. Schaefer, like some, there's a lot of good like blue chip producers that aren't charging. There's a whole another subset of producers like Harlan Estate or Arajo or some of like more culty wines that are like really expensive. You don't have to. You can find some amazing Napa Cabernet for under 100 anyway. Like really, and that's going to be really prestige. And if they want, they can age it. The other couple of wines that I mentioned, Spanish Rioja is fabulous, although not a lot of people are necessarily tuned into it. They might not know what they're getting, but you show up at their house with a wine that's like 10 years old and it's super delicious and it costs you 60, $70. It's pretty cool to something with some age. And they
Mhm.
typically have very ornate labels and they can be a real conversation piece. Barolo, as I mentioned, and Barbaresco from Piedmont in Italy. Tons of stuff 60 and under that you can get. That is super prestige, like age worthy. Put it in the cellar for 20 years, killer stuff. Or put it in a decanter and drink it now. Um, Brunello di Montalcino, very, very, like said, nice high end gift, very nice high end gift, and lots of stuff still well under 100 there. Yeah, we're going hard on this gifting thing. This is
That's great. And tell me a little more then about Sommselect. What do you guys offer?
its origins were as a daily flash sale, if you will. So
Hmm.
one wine, a lot of detail about that wine each day sent to your email. Hey, today we are offering this. And it has since evolved beyond the daily offers to include a series of monthly club subscriptions. We have three clubs actually, where you receive 6 bottles per month. One is called the Blind Six, which is a blind tasting kit. We were talking about blind tasting earlier. The co-founder of Sommselect was a master sommelier, so born out of that experience, we send you 6 bottles of wine. They're all wrapped in black tissue paper, so you can't see what they are.
Hmm.
Although if you're the one opening the bottle, you can see the cork, you can see the capsule, right? So you have to have somebody else ideally uncork the bottles for you so that you're truly tasting blind. Because there's a lot you could gather from most of these corks, right? So you get it shipped to you. We have a little tasting guide that comes with it and a note. So there's like 2 little sections where we go through we walk you through all the process of blind tasting the wine. What does it look like? What is it? So all the process that a master sommelier would go through, and you're trying to do it yourself.
What's the purpose for that? Is it for to prepare for exam or just for fun?
A lot of people subscribe to it because they're preparing for exams. It's a lot of
Gotcha.
professional people subscribe to it, but we've found that there are also consumers that have just people that love wine, and they have a
Mhm.
group that they get together. These one guys, we did a Instagram live with, and there's this one group of guys on the East Coast. I forget where they were. It was like Rhode Island or Connecticut, where they rent out a conference room in a local hotel and they have someone serve it for them and they all do it, and it's like a competition. It's like a competition who's coming up with the answers. There's because it's a bottle of each wine, so you don't want to just do it yourself. That's a lot of wine. And they're
Yeah.
all good wines that you would enjoy having in your house for however long. But once you've opened them, then they're kind of live at that point, so you want to use them. So these guys had at least a half a dozen guys, and they're all in their room, and they're having a showdown every month with the blind tasting kit. And they enjoy that education and that sort of guessing the right wine and all that. Then we have 2 clubs that are just curated by us, that are just 6 of our favorites from the month, from our month of tastings, that we think would be interesting. And it's very much like that idea of, let me be in your hands. You put me in your hands, pick me out some good stuff. I'm curious. It's really for people who are curious, who are willing to try new things, because we're putting stuff that we might not put in a daily offer because it might be a little too weird for a daily offer. Like not enough people would be willing to take a flyer on it, but in a club, they're like, yeah, I'll check out a Hungarian white wine that I've never heard of before, or we source from all over the world, right? So there's one club is called the Somm Six, which is what you typically 3 whites and 3 reds. The other is just a red only 6 pack. And then finally, we have a club called Explore Four, which is our biggest club and most popular. It's $99 a month plus shipping. It's 4 wines shipped every month, and it is a different theme each month. And it's
So
an
wait,
education.
$99 and you get
It's
four bottles of wine?
a good deal.
Gee,
5 bucks a
yeah.
bottle. And they're good wines, and they're wines that are chosen according to a rotating theme. So the idea of like how a sommelier often tastes wines is by comparing like items, right? If I want to put a Chablis on my list, I want to have a good idea of what's out there in the world of Chablis. What's the world of Chablis all about? Who's making the best Chablis? But which producers do I like the best? So this is a kind of a comparative tasting exercise that might be focused on a certain region. It might be focused on a certain grape variety. It might be focused on another concept, like a soil, like wines from a certain soil type. You know, you hear constantly people talking about limestone soil. We'll pick out 4 wines from different places in the world that have limestone soil and say, what do these wines have in common? What are different about them? The most recent one we did was an exploration of the Douro region of Portugal. So it's just that one region of Portugal, and it's table wines from the Douro region of Portugal. So it's 2 whites and 2 reds. So what are the typical grape varieties? So it's like getting to know a certain category of wine in more intimate detail. It might be 4 wines from the Cabernet Franc grape. It might be 4 wines from the Chardonnay grape. And it might be 4 wines from around the world from the Chardonnay grape, right? So it's like a California Chardonnay versus a French Chardonnay versus an Australian Chardonnay versus a Swiss Chardonnay, whatever. So different takes on the same variety and sort of explaining this idea of terroir, like how where it grows matters. It affects the personality of the wine in very tangible ways, and this enables you to compare and contrast within that thematic category.
How do you even select that? You get wineries reaching out to you asking to taste their wines, or
Yeah, we have
vice versa?
we buy wine a lot like a restaurant sommelier would buy wine, which
Hmm.
is a kind of a combination of 2 things. When we get to travel, that's awesome, and experience different wine regions and sort of experience different producers or go to wine fairs and things like that. But most of the wine that we offer on our site walks through our door in some way, shape, or form by way of an importer or a distributor sales representative who brings those wines in, and we check them out. And based on our tasting experience, I mean, we're tasting all the time. We're tasting hundreds of wines a month and sort of saying, okay, so like for example, I program the Explore 4. So I come up with the themes and I'll say, all right, I want to do something on, well, let's say Chardonnay from around the world. And so then I'm going to use my taste memory of stuff that I've used either on wine lists or I've tried recently, but I'll go out and I'll start talking, and I'll have a few things in my mind already, and I'll find their importer or their distributor, and I'll say, you know what, I think this would work. Can can we check out this wine? Can we check out this wine from this region, this producer? I think that'd be a great example of a French Chardonnay. And then I go to my American Chardonnay and I go, okay, who should I think for that? And I have to think about price because there's
Yeah,
certain stuff we can't do. There's
yeah.
certain things there's certain themes we're never going to be able to do in that club. But we can give people this great sort of under like basic knowledge about certain parts of the world or certain grape varieties that's what it's about. It's that exploration because a lot of people will be like, okay, I know I like Chardonnay. I don't know if I like something else. And a lot of people just would never bother to do like we did a Riesling spectrum. We did one that was focused on Riesling. Now there's a new frontier that a lot of people are afraid to venture into in wine because they think Riesling is going to be sweet and they've been conditioned to think it's going to be bad because it's sweet, even though there's nothing wrong with a wine being somewhat sweet. That's not a flaw. It's just something that got associated with bad wine because people used to drink Blue Nun, which is like a crappy German sweet Riesling. That was just a bad quality mass produced wine. People used to think that it was a graduation, like you first had a sweet palate and then you developed a palate for dry wines. But I think that's evolving.
I'm fascinated with this. I thought this interview would be like 30 minutes max, and I'm enjoying it so much. Jesus, it's fantastic. I've learned so much. David, thank you very much, and I will definitely leave the links to your books and to Sommselect because it seems like it's for people who likes wine. This is the amazing thing.
Sommselect, the thing about Sommselect that I will leave with you is that we go deep, so like if you're, and we write it for people that are curious, not people that are experts. We're writing our offers go into great detail about each wine, so it's kind of like not only what it's like, but why it is that way and what you might enjoy it with. Like we put food pairings in our offers. We share recipe, we share links to recipes. Hey, buy this wine, make a pizza. Do you like making pizza? Make a pizza and have this wine with it. Serve it at this temperature. Um, Put it in this kind of glass. Like all we take it down to the granular, so that we can kind of get people in the habit of serving and using wines the right way, and enjoying them like the right way, which means not serving your red wine, for example, at 75 degrees, which is most room temperatures, right? You want it a lot cooler than that. And not serving your white wine at like 30 degrees, like where it's like practically freezing. It's too cold, right? So like little silly stuff like that, but it's like just, and you should be, and we have a whole like sort of style spectrum. So like if you're someone who likes rich, sweet white wines, there are certain wines that you'll be able to tell, no, that's not for me. But others you will. We have a whole little graphic where it describes how full bodied it is, how much acid there is, how much alcohol there is, like a whole like little breakdown there. So we try to be really detailed about what you're getting, so that it's not just this blind selection on a shelf. Like, what is this? Absent of being able to actually taste it like you can in a restaurant, for example, this is the next best thing, which is us going into great detail about what it tastes like, what it would be good with, what it compares to. Like a lot of times, if it's an unfamiliar thing, we might be able to put it in a context that's more familiar to people who are more beginner. So it's like having a sommelier in your house.